Breaking Bidenomics, brought to you by Birch Gold Group.
The Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal have started to call my plan Bidenomics. Initially, I don't think they meant it with a great deal of respect. With all due respect toward them, our plan is working.
Bidenomics is working.
That's Bidenomics in action. And the American people are beginning to feel Bidenomics.
That's the American dream. That's Bidenomics.
And Bidenomics is working.
And guess what? Bidenomics is working.
Welcome to Breaking Bidenomics with Josh Hammer, presented by Birch Gold. So we'll be with you for the next hour breaking down Bidenomics. As you can hear there, Joe Biden is running his 2024 re-election campaign primarily, it seems, on the issue of so-called Bidenomics. In fact, just this past Thursday evening, the NFL had their season opener in Kansas City, and the Biden 2024 re-election campaign, which up until now was basically just a basement campaign, they have their first kind of sweeping national ad buy. They decided to make it on this issue, on Bidenomics. Here's this ad that they titled "Got to Work."
They said millions would lose their jobs and the economy would collapse. But this president refused to let that happen. Instead, he got to work, fixing supply chains, fighting corporate greed, passing laws to lower the cost of medicine, cut utility bills, and make us more energy independent. Today, inflation is down to 3%, unemployment the lowest in decades. There's more to do, but President Biden is getting results that matter.
I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
Let's be very clear. This is gaslighting on stilts. They are asking the American people, they are asking us not to believe our own lying eyes. They are trying to offer up a turd sandwich, convince you that it is a tasty filet mignon, and that if you squint just hard enough, then you will actually see that this man, the doddering dolt from Delaware, the octogenarian Joseph R. Biden himself, has actually been a Reagan-esque figure when it comes to the economy. It's not going to work, folks. The American people will see right through this ruse. Let's start to actually break down a little bit what Bidenomics actually means, as opposed to the gaslighting version that the Biden 2024 re-election campaign is trying to sell you on. So, for starters, we actually learned just this past week, per the Committee for Fiscal Responsibility, that the national deficit this year is literally going to double from approximately $1 trillion to $2 trillion. Now, historically speaking, you have massive deficit spending at times of recession, at times of war, World War II being the quintessential example here. We are in neither of those things right now. We are now 3.5 years after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, and Joe Biden and this Congress are still spending like absolutely drunk sailors. The fiscal incontinence is totally through the roof. And, bear in mind, that number, that $2 trillion national deficit that we currently have in this country for fiscal year 2023, that would actually be even higher if the U.S. Supreme Court had not properly enjoined Joe Biden's unconstitutional unilateral action to, quote unquote, forgive student loans to the tune of $400 billion. So that number would actually be even higher. Overall, now that we are a few years into the Joe Biden presidency, the United States' debt to GDP ratio is over 123%. Now, going back to the Bush and Obama presidencies, for years and years, you had bipartisan economists from across the political spectrum basically saying that the point of no return, the danger point when it comes to debt to GDP ratio is 100%. Around this time, 2010, 2011 or so, you had some sovereign debt crises in Southern Europe affecting countries such as Greece and Italy. And at the time, all the discussion was about how 100% debt to GDP ratio was this terrible point that you cannot possibly get past. Well, under Joe Biden, we are now at 123% debt to GDP ratio. Folks, it really does not get a whole lot worse than that. And last year, lest we forget, what does Bidenomics actually mean? Well, 2022, perhaps of all years, really encapsulates that. The United States formally entered a recession in the year 2022. I think all this gaslighting, they really want you to forget that. But the first 2 quarters of the fiscal year last year saw negative 1.6% GDP growth roughly, and then negative 0.9% GDP growth roughly. Now, last I checked, when I studied economics back in the day, when I worked as an antitrust researcher, A recession was defined as consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. This was not a disputed thing. Every economist worth his or her salt, every political prognosticator, commentator, elected official, any candidate for office would tell you that it is the universally accepted definition of a recession to have consecutive quarters, 2 quarters in a row, of negative GDP growth. Having said that, last summer, we had multiple actors within the Biden administration, such as Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, and Brian Deese, the former top economist for the Biden administration, trying to tell us that, contrary to decades, if not centuries, of the universally accepted definition of what a recession is, actually means something a little different.
Well, we're certainly in a transition, and we are seeing slowing as we all would have expected. But I think if you look at the full data and the type of data that NBER looks at, virtually nothing signals that this period in the second quarter is recessionary.
There are many factors. Economic factors and indicators to consider. And I will say that the textbook definition of recession is not 2 negative quarters of GDP. Right now, we don't see a recession. Right now, we're not in a recession right now. Right now, we're in a transition.
Right, we're in a transition. Now, who are you going to take at their word for the definition of recession? What economists, PhDs, all the fancy degree people have been saying on this for decades and decades, uninterrupted and universally, unanimously? Or are you going to take the dim-witted White House press secretary who's trying to get her way out of a pickle? Tough choice. So yes, contrary to what they want you to believe with this got to work ad and all of their 2024 re-election campaign messaging, the United States entered a recession in 2022. That is not exactly a winning re-election campaign strategy, to say the least. But it actually gets worse than that. At the same time that we had back-to-back quarters of negative GDP growth, and contrary to the gaslighting you just heard, we did enter a formal recession. At that same time, inflation reached 40-year highs. We had the worst inflation in America in 2022 since the stagflation of the Jimmy Carter era, the late 1970s, which took heroic efforts from then President Ronald Reagan and then Fed Chairman Paul Volcker to tamp down. That was 40 years. Last summer, at its actual peak, inflation annualized on the CPI basis reached 9.1%. Again, that is a shocking figure. You know, for many years during the Obama presidency into the Trump presidency, all the chatter in Washington, D.C., as we saw these increasingly skyrocketing deficits, as we saw ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, starting with Fed Chair Ben Bernanke, continued into the subsequent Fed regimes. As all of that was taking place, the bipartisan chatter was, will the chickens come home to roost? Will the inflation finally come home to roost of this endless bipartisan uniparty spending like drunken sailors, this extended continuous Federal Reserve policy of zero interest rate? And the answer, it turns out, is yes. It took a little bit of time, but the answer, it turns out, was yes. We had horrible inflation last year. Gasoline prices last year, according to AAA, reached among the highest ever, the highest in the history of the recorded metrics of that particular figure. And inflation for certain items as well, certain kind of household staples, grocery staples, chicken, eggs. You know, the annualized inflation for a carton of eggs last year, again at its summertime, June or July 2022 peak, was up 32 to 33% on an annualized basis. I mean, you really can't make this stuff up. Wages, furthermore, have declined in real terms over the past 2.5, 3 years of the Biden presidency. Wages have not kept up with inflation. They have started to turn around over the past couple of months, but they have not even come close to turning around to compensate for the real wage declines that we saw for the first 2.5 years of the presidency. And of course, you know, we mentioned the price of gasoline. You really can't talk about Bidenomics without talking about this sweeping, sprawling across the entire spectrum, full throttle approach to the war on domestic energy, the war on fossil fuels. And you can't ignore the fact that Joe Biden, you know, he is so far removed from his working class Joe from Scranton. Oh, Uncle Joe. I mean, this is how this man for decades and decades presented himself as kind of a hardscrabble, relatable America from Appalachia. He is so far removed from that, and he is at this point, Joe Biden is at this point a pure cat's paw of green radical zealots and misanthropes. So let's take a bit of a look specifically when it comes to energy. So Joe Biden's very, very first day as president of the United States, if you want to go back to January 2021, he decides to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline, which was this purportedly controversial pipeline going up from the Alberta tar sands up in Calgary and Edmonton, going all the way down to oil refiners in Louisiana on the Gulf Coast. He decided to nix that on day one. Also, on day one of his presidency, Joe Biden put a leasing moratorium in place on the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, commonly known as ANWR. Now, speaking of ANWR, you might be wondering why ANWR sounds familiar. Well, that's because ANWR has recently been in the news. Well, it turns out that just last week, Joe Biden and his ham-fisted Department of the Interior put new limits on leases in ANWR. They revoked 7 leases in ANWR, 7 that the Trump administration put into effect on its way out the door in January 2021. They also moved to limit development on 13 million acres of the National Petroleum Reserve, which is kind of close to ANWR there in northern Alaska. So the net effect of this is just a massive, massive tamping down on drilling up in Alaska right now, canceling upwards of 40% of all federal leases in the National Petroleum Reserve. But it actually gets worse than that. There's actually a bit of a woke twist to this. If you want to know just how far off the reservation Biden and his Department of Interior have gone, if you listen to what his Department of Interior has said as to why they're cracking down on drilling in ANWR and the National Petroleum Reserve, they are citing among the various factors. I mean, they have the usual things. They're talking about how they didn't do a proper job of looking at carbon emissions and global warming, climate, all that stuff. They also cite indigenous knowledge. Now, recall, this is northern Alaska. There's a lot of American Indians and indigenous Alaskans up there in that part of the state. But when they quote indigenous knowledge here, it's literally exactly what it sounds like here. I mean, this is not the kind of thing that is quantifiable. It is floofy, and it is basically saying that we spoke to the tribes on the ground. They kind of maybe prefer to save the caribou or the moose or their fishing availabilities. They want to catch their salmon a little more easily, and we're just going to take them at their word, and therefore we're going to crack down on drilling. That is literally what the Biden administration is doing when it comes to oil and natural gas. And sure enough, it's very predictable. We're feeling the pain at the pump. So the average price of gasoline right now in America is a little over $3.80 a gallon. That number out west in the western U.S. is much higher than that. California, predictably, is the worst of all. The average price of gasoline in California now is well over $5.30 a gallon. Truly, truly galling stuff. At the end of the Trump administration, that number of the average price of gasoline nationally was roughly $2 to $2.50 or so. So we've gone up by 50 to 75% or so. I mean, this is not pretty stuff. At the same time, because the Biden administration has decided so much to crack down on our own hydrocarbons, on our own oil and natural gas that this country is blessed, yes, blessed, to sit atop, at the same time, he has been forced to go all around the world to grovel before hostile or at least not particularly friendly regimes to beg them for gas. So at the same time that Joe Biden is canceling the Keystone XL pipeline, the same time that he is canceling federal oil and natural gas leases throughout all of the United States, most recently up in ANWR and the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska, around the same time, he is going to places like Venezuela, Iran, Saudi Arabia, begging them to produce more oil. And as it turns out, because Joe Biden's foreign policy also stinks to high heaven, they're not listening to him. In fact, just last week, the Saudis and the Russians announced further oil production cuts for the rest of 2023. So you combine that with this cracking down on the drilling in ANWR and the National Petroleum Reserve, man, I mean, you're looking at potentially just absolutely massive spikes in gasoline prices for the rest of this calendar year. How about the housing crisis? Look, as someone who is on the housing market right now, I can tell you the housing market is an absolute atrocity. This is a terrible, terrible time to try to buy a house. Home prices have actually been rising despite the fact that Fed Chair Jerome Powell has been forced to raise interest rates to try to tamp down this ridiculous Biden inflation that again reached a peak of 9.1% on an annualized basis last summer. Home prices are still rising, despite the fact that Fed Chair Powell has raised interest rates, probably is going to have to continue raising interest rates over the course of the remainder of this year. And you know what's incredible is that the median mortgage payment for an American with a mortgage payment has actually more than doubled over the past 3 years, literally more than doubled. It was 14% of monthly household income. That was the median mortgage payment back in 2020. Earlier this summer, it reached 29%. So housing prices are increasing at the same time that mortgage payments are going through the roof. There was a historic supply chain crisis back in 2021. Many toddlers missed their Christmas gifts that year due to the absolute idiocy of Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of Indiana's fifth largest crime-ridden city, who doesn't know a damn thing in the world about how to run anything pertaining to transportation. At that time, you had ships off of the ocean that couldn't dock because there was a shortage of dock workers. There were truckers who were going on strike. A historic supply chain crisis, that also is what Bidenomics means. Americans currently have a personal savings rate. Americans aren't saving either. They have a savings rate of 3.50%. That is literally less than half the historical long-term average, which is well over 8, closer to 9%. Look, here's what it boils down to across the spectrum, from inflation to the war on energy, to the decline of real wages, to all of the above. Bidenomics, no matter what they tell you, is a war on the middle and working class. It is a class war. It is a war on those who disproportionately rely upon fossil fuels. It is a war on those who rely on fixed incomes, on retirees who are struggling to get by because they need a certain return on their investment. And with inflation the way that it is, interest rates, they are not able to get it. So Bidenomics has been a complete and utter catastrophe, no matter the ridiculous and obtuse lies that this administration tells you. Now, coming up, we're going to hear from Joel Griffith. He's a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. I have a sneaking suspicion that one thing that Joel's going to want to talk about as a possible hedge against Bidenflation would be gold. And I can tell you, as someone who has had gold in his personal portfolio for well over a decade now, I think this is a very, very shrewd move. Because, there are 3 reasons that across the world, the central banks are dumping the U.S. dollar: inflation, deficit spending, and our insurmountable national debt, all of which we have discussed already here. And the fact is that there is only one asset that has withstood famine, wars, and political and economic upheaval dating back literally to biblical times, and that asset is gold. And you can own it in a tax-sheltered retirement account with the help of Birch Gold Group. That's right. Birch Gold will help you convert an existing IRA or 401k, maybe from a previous employer, into an IRA in gold. And the best part, you don't pay a penny out of pocket. Text the word Josh to 989898 for your free info kit. They'll hold your hand through the whole process. It's totally seamless. Think about this. When currencies fail, as the US dollar increasingly is, gold is the safe haven. How much more time does the dollar have? Protect your savings with gold. Birch Gold has an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau and thousands of happy customers. Again, text Josh to the number 989898. Get your free info kit on gold. Again, text Josh to 989898.
Breaking Bidenomics, brought to you by Birch Gold Group. Breaking Bidenomics, brought to you by Birch Gold Group.
Shovels in the ground, cranes in the air, factories opening, all those jobs, meaning we created. We've created more than 12,000 brand new jobs in 2 years. That's more than any president in American history has created in 4 years. That means overall, we've created more jobs in 2 years than any administration has created in the first 4 years. And I think all this matters. It's no accident. Our economy has created 10 million jobs, 668 manufacturing jobs. They were wrong. We recovered all the manufacturing jobs we lost during the pandemic. If you look at my presidency so far, it's a jobs presidency.
Welcome back. I mean, as painful as it is to listen there to the senile liar-in-chief, it's important to break down what is going so wrong with Bidenomics. So joining us now to do exactly that is Joel Griffith. He's a research fellow with the Heritage Foundation. Joel, there's a lot to unpack there just from what we just heard. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack more generally from this total crap storm of Bidenomics that we've all been subjected to for the past 2.5 years. One thing that I know that you've been passionate about, and I'm passionate about as well, is the housing market. I mean, Joe Biden is not really making much reference there to the fact that mortgage rates have effectively doubled over the past 3 years of his presidency. Does anyone there know anything about the housing market, and do they care about vulnerable Americans who are struggling to purchase a first home or a second home?
Well, thanks for having me. And President Biden certainly doesn't seem to show that he understands just how painful the housing market is for typical American families right now. And if you go back just a few years ago, you could get into a standard median priced home and your mortgage payment would be under $1,000 per month. Well, since those interest rates bottomed out, really the very first month of President Biden's presidency, home prices have increased by 25%, while mortgage rates have almost tripled. And so what that means for you is if you're looking to just buy a median priced home, your mortgage is no longer $975 a month. You're paying over $2,000 a month to get that home. And we've never had a time in our nation's history in which home affordability has been worse. And that's not just in terms of the actual sticker price on the home. We're talking about the percentage of a person's income that it takes to afford the mortgage. It takes about 45% of a typical person's income to get into just a typical home. That's about twice the level that it was at just several years ago, and it's far above where it was at historically in this country. He doesn't seem to acknowledge the problem, and he certainly has not put forward solutions to that problem.
And even more than that, I mean, the Federal Reserve is not exactly helping the situation out either. I mean, inflation, Joel, as you know, it's come down a little bit from its summertime 2022 peaks. But when I say it's come down a little bit, it's still hovering in the 3.5% to 4% range, which is essentially double what the Federal Reserve's actual 2% target is. How worried should the median consumer American continue to be? The median consumer, the median saver, the median home purchaser? How worried should we all be about inflation now that it's been over a year since its actual summertime peak in 2022?
We need to be very concerned. And that's because even though the inflation rate has come down somewhat from the 40-year highs that we saw about a year ago, inflation was running at 8% annually. It's now running closer to 3.5%, 4%. That is still far above the historical norm. And second of all, even if the inflation rate were to come back to the historical norm of 2% per year, that does zero to close the gap in real wages that we've seen. We've seen real wages decline by $5,000 annually for a typical family. If inflation suddenly comes down to right about where wage growth is, you're still looking at a real wage cut of $400 per month because that gap still exists. Second of all, there's been no acknowledgement of the role that the Federal Reserve has played in the housing problem as well. It's not just inflation overall. Our central bank printed trillions of dollars, not just to fund government operations. That, of course, was inflationary. We saw the monetary base increase sixfold over the past 15 years or so. That's immense. And we saw it accelerate over the past few years. But the Federal Reserve also printed trillions of dollars to buy up mortgage-backed securities. So that inflated home prices even more. And now we're stuck in this catch-22 situation where if the Fed tries to remedy the problem that it caused by increasing interest rates, and if you increase the rates, well, that deters people from taking out more loans, which hopefully will suppress money supply growth. But if you increase those rates, obviously you also make it more difficult to expand your business or to purchase a home. There's no easy way out of this. And it's time the Federal Reserve acknowledge responsibility, which Chair Powell still refuses to do.
And in addition to inflation, it's obviously also a fiscal issue. So you're getting whacked by both sides, basically. You're getting whacked from the central bank, and you're also getting whacked from Congress spending like drunken sailors. So, Joel, I'm sure you saw recently the national deficit this year is projected to literally double to $2 trillion, which historically speaking, you would only expect to see a deficit of that magnitude relative to gross domestic product in a time of prolonged war, such as World War II, or maybe a horrific depression, such as the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. We are in neither of those things. And yet here we are with a deficit that is going to reach $2 trillion. Seems to me like inflation is probably only going to get a lot worse than that. It's the old theory of just throwing money at things. I mean, what do you expect is going to happen? Inflation is obviously going to get worse. Joel, why can't Congress get the spending under control, man? I mean, what is going on there? It's Biden, it's Democrats, it's Republicans. Does anyone in D.C. care about controlling spending at this point?
Far too few do. I mean, there's, of course, a few senators that call attention to this issue, including Senator Rand Paul and Senator Mike Lee, but there's far too few politicians willing to address it. And that's for several reasons. For a long time, our federal government got away with spending beyond its means. And that's because our economy, thanks to our free market, mostly free market system, our economy continued to grow in real terms. And that was able to mask some of the consequences of inflation. We still had inflation. It was still a harm to families, but it wasn't nearly as dramatic. But often politicians know that they can punt this problem down the road. Now it's really starting to catch up with us as we're feeling the impact at 8% inflation rate. But politicians have discovered or rediscovered something else. They're easily able to put the blame on inflation onto other factors. Remember, early on in the war between Ukraine and Russia, early on, our politicians were blaming inflation on Putin. When that became less of an economic issue, well, they put the blame, a lot of left-wing politicians put the blame on greed. Politicians know they can get away with shifting the blame. And meanwhile, most people will never take a look at a chart of the Federal Reserve and see, well, gee, what is this $9 trillion in dollars that were created out of thin air? And does that have an impact on my life? Well, it has a very real impact on our life. That's why it's very important, I think, for folks like you in the media to drive home this point, that the pain that we're feeling right now at the pump, the pain we're feeling at the grocery store or renting a home, that is directly related to the immensely reckless fiscal decisions that Congress has made over many years, and it's only magnified the past 3 years.
Well, there you go, folks. Joel Griffith, research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Thanks for joining Breaking Bidenomics.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
Coming up next, Daniel Horowitz. He's a senior editor for The Blaze and host of the Conservative Review podcast. Daniel is never short for opinions. Stay tuned to hear what he has to say about Breaking Bidenomics.
Breaking Bidenomics, brought to you by Birch Gold Group. Breaking Bidenomics, brought to you by Birch Gold Group.
Joining us now, one of my very favorites. He's a senior editor for The Blaze, host of the Conservative Review podcast, the great Daniel Horowitz. So, Daniel, thanks so much for joining us this time. So you've been so outspoken on basically everything pertaining to COVID. Of course, you and Steve Deace have a book out on this very subject. I want to focus here on the effect of COVID on the economy, on spending, inflation, all of that. We just had a debt ceiling fight earlier this year between President Biden and Speaker McCarthy. We're coming up to another budget battle later this month in September. I mean, we basically locked in the COVID era spending levels, haven't we? And is there any end to that in sight?
You know, any economic or fiscal chart you look at from 1790 until now, there's one big blip in 2020. Everything we are facing today economically, everything with the inflation and the second and third order of magnitude, with the vicious cycle of debt-driven inflation, reinforcing higher interest rates, higher interest payments, more debt, reinforcing more printing money, creating more inflation. That degenerative cycle we're in is all a legacy of COVID. It finally was too much that all the magic tricks that our government had to use the printing press and the servicing of the treasuries in order to keep it afloat, it went to hell. And, you know, that this is a legacy of basically $10 trillion between the fiscal and monetary spending and printing. The Federal Reserve bought up about $2.5 trillion of mortgage-backed securities, which created a crazy bubble in the housing market at record low interest rates. And then because the debt and inflation, they had to raise the interest rates. So now we have record high pricing and high mortgage rates and high servicing of debt. This is the long economic COVID equivalent of what we're seeing physically with people having the ailments from COVID and the vaccines, that where the body just never works well again. So, you know, let's be clear. This cake was baked with the 2020 policies, the CARES Act, the worst piece of legislation in American history. Biden obviously added icing on the top, but every Republican says, oh, the Biden inflation is terrible. If your name is not Thomas Massie or a few other people, you baked that cake. Okay, the bottom line is it's inseparable. inflation is when you have too much money chasing too few goods. Well, what did they do? They created more money than ever, quicker than ever, and they shut off the production of goods. So, and usually it's about a 12 to 18 month lag. We got it 12 to 18 months later. Had Trump had a second term, he would have been settled with it. Now, on the supply side, Biden did a couple things that I think Trump wouldn't have done, shutting down a lot of our drilling, irresponsibly tapping the strategic petroleum reserves and then not refilling them at the cheaper prices, dragging out the Ukraine war and the embargo, which put stress on some of the supply side aspects of this. The Green New Deal added extra spending, but the core inflation is a legacy of COVID fascism.
And, what is our way out of this? I mean, I think back to the speaker fight in January, Daniel, when you and I, as we often are, were two of the only people, it seems, in conservative media, not just instantly drinking the Kool-Aid when it came to Kevin McCarthy, and McCarthy ends up folding like a cheap suit with the Biden debt ceiling negotiation back in May and June. Is there any end to the tunnel here? Do you see any light at the end of the tunnel for getting our spending just back to pre-COVID levels? Not that it was a particularly good level then, but is there any way to just get it back to that pre-COVID baseline?
Well, obviously, that's what we need to fight about. And I think the message needs to be not a single penny come midnight October 1st, unless there are serious both spending and policy reforms. The bottom line is, even if you're one of these fools that's scared of a temporary, non-essential government shutdown, what we are facing, here's the important thing about the debt, what we're seeing with inflation. Our whole lives, we warned about it, but people viewed it as a government problem, a spreadsheet problem. This is a you problem. We are feeling it now, and you are never going to get out of it unless we make a degree of spending cuts that no one wants to do. It is so bad, Josh, that right now, see, interest rates aren't even that high historically, and yet it's crushing. We now are at a rate this month, last couple of months, of $1 trillion just on interest of the debt annually. That's greater than the entire Pentagon. And some months it's even surpassed Medicare. Last month it did. And this is just the opening baseline. We have, this is the new spending. The new deficits are all being serviced at the higher interest rates. We have accrued $1.4 trillion in debt just since the debt ceiling. What did Kevin McCarthy call it? The greatest spending cuts in American history. But we have, within the next year, $7.6 trillion of the existing debt maturing that's going to be serviced at 4 times a higher rate. This baby is over with. And it's so bad now that you could raise interest rates as high as you want. It cannot stop that degree of inflation from flooding the market with that much new printed money to service the debt. So now we're incurring the liabilities of higher interest rates without even the benefits. So we have the record high standard of living that has not gone back, and it's still going up. Make no doubt about it. It's not going up at the crazy rate of 2021. Yeah, but it's not reversing it back to where it should be. So permanently, we are boxing middle income people, upper middle income people out of the American dream. You need an average of $3,500 a month now to pay the taxes, interest, mortgage, and insurance on an average size home. You need about $750 a month to service an average car. Basic essentials have become luxuries, and this is just getting started.
Well, Daniel Horowitz, you never pull any punches. You're the host of the Great Conservative Review podcast. Thanks so much for joining Breaking Bidenomics.
We'll see you later, Josh. Take care.
Coming up next on the program, we have Philip Patrick. He is the precious metals specialist for Birch Gold Group. And speaking of Birch Gold Group, I've had gold in my own portfolio now for well over a decade at this point. Going back centuries, even thousands of years, going back quite literally to biblical times, there is only one asset, there is only one investment that is known to withstand famine, war, you name it, everything out there, and it is gold. And it turns out you can own it. You can own gold in a tax-sheltered retirement account with the help of Birch Gold Group. That's right, Birch Gold will help you convert an existing IRA or 401k, maybe from a previous employer, into an IRA in gold. Best part, you don't pay a penny out of pocket. Just text the word Josh to 989-898 for your free info kit. They'll hold your hand through the whole process. It's totally seamless. When currencies fail, gold is a safe haven. How much more time does the dollar have? Well, protect your savings with gold. Birch Gold has an A-plus rating with the Better Business Bureau, thousands of happy customers. Again, you can text Josh to the number 989-898 for your free info kit on gold. Again, text Josh to 989-898.
Breaking Bidenomics, brought to you by Birch Gold Group. Breaking Bidenomics, brought to you by Birch Gold Group.
I think, American workers and the whole economy is going to grow in a way that we haven't seen it grow in a long time. This is the time for us to move. So today, the U.S. has the highest economic growth rate, leading the world economies. What you're seeing is enormous growth in the country. Even with the pandemic, we've generated a record job creation, a record economic growth in this country.
What can you do to prevent a recession?
Continue to grow the economy. And we're growing the economy. It's growing in a way that it hasn't in years and years.
This guy. Joining us now, Philip Patrick. He is the precious metal specialist at Birch Gold Group. Philip, thank you so much for joining us. So over the course of this hour, we've listened to Joe Biden say that Bidenomics is doing so well, the median consumer, investor, home purchaser, and so forth, that they're all flourishing. Is Bidenomics actually succeeding? Is the median American economically better off right now than they were 4 years ago?
Well, I think that is a very good question. Look, if you cherry pick numbers, you can make an argument for growth, but I think it's a mistake to just focus on economic growth. Look at GDP, for example, right? It's an abstraction. It's just one way to measure overall productivity. And things like high inflation that we've been feeling for the last few years really can skew those numbers. So I think the question that you posed is a better one, right? Is the average American doing better today? Right? We should focus on not whether Bidenomics is working, but whether it's working for the individual. I think that's the question that really matters. Are we better off than we were before the pandemic? And I think the short answer to that is no.
And if you had to pinpoint or if you had to choose really one or maybe two reasons as to why you feel confident that the answer is no, what would you choose? I mean, we have inflation, we have soaring national deficits, we have foreign policy chaos around the world. What do you think are the most glaring economic problems facing the median American right now?
Look, I think you mentioned a lot of them right there. But if we look at the last 2.5 years, I think the numbers tell a very clear story for the average American household. Food at home is up 20%. Electricity prices up 21%. Gasoline prices are up 72%. Now let's look at housing, which is obviously most people's biggest expense. Rent payments rose 25%. Median mortgage payments are up 85%. In January of 2021, a $3,000 monthly budget would buy you a $640,000 home. Today, that same budget buys a $434,000 home. That's a 32% reduction in purchasing power thanks to higher mortgage rates as well as higher prices, which leads me to the next point. Home prices themselves are up 30% since January of 2021. Now, very importantly, because this is where people feel the pain, wage growth has trailed inflation consistently. The average household's purchasing power has taken a $6,000 a year pay cut. In other words, it's not our imagination. Virtually every essential is significantly more expensive today. And because wages haven't kept up, consumer debt has recently hit an all-time high, over $1 trillion in credit card balances today. Basically, people are desperately trying to maintain their standards of living in the face of Bidenomics. Now, we could call that economic growth, or you could call it taking on more debt to make ends meet. Inflation today is making that almost impossible. So I think if you start to delve into the numbers, we start to see the real story.
Yeah, inflation has, of course, been a leitmotif of this hour-long special. And from my perspective, it continues to be one of the most debilitating issues facing the median American consumer, investor, home purchaser, perhaps above all. inflation is supposed to be the bailiwick, Philip. It's supposed to be the bailiwick of central bankers and the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve recently had their annual meeting out in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Do you trust Fed Chair Jerome Powell and the current Board of Governors to get inflation under control? I mean, admittedly, the number has come down a little bit from its 40-year high that it reached last summer, but it continues to be well above the 2% target that the Federal Reserve explicitly prescribes. Do you have any faith that they are prepared to do what it takes to get that number down further, or are you or are you still skeptical of that?
So first of all, a couple of points there. Number one, inflation or headline inflation has been coming down, but core inflation, which is everything outside of food and energy, has been proving particularly sticky. It's been flat for over a year. So what that tells us, the only meaningful reduction we're seeing is either in food prices or energy prices. Well, guess what? Food prices are up significantly. So the only meaningful reduction we're seeing is in energy prices, and they're on the rise again. Oil hit $90 a barrel a couple of days ago. So it's pretty clear that the Fed haven't really got a handle on inflation. In terms of Powell's ability to deal with it, look, I think the Jackson Hole meeting was really telling. The one takeaway I had from this 3-day meeting is just perplexity. It's clear central bankers around the world are struggling to understand the current climate. Powell said it himself. He said central bankers were navigating by the stars under cloudy skies. Christine Lagarde, who's obviously the European Central Bank president, said there is no historical precedent for today's woes. She can't understand why in a climate where interest rates are going up, employment is still high. So I think central bankers around the world are really struggling. The problem with Powell for me is not so much a desire to fix the issues or the will to fix the issues, but rather the tools to fix the issues, right? He's very limited in terms of what he can do at the moment. So for example, if they want to stimulate growth in the economy, what have they got to do? They've got to lower rates and pump money through the economy, which they cannot do because it fuels the inflationary climate. So instead, they've got to raise the interest rate. But we're seeing problems there. Look at the squeeze it put on the banking system earlier in the year. Look at the amount of national debt we have. If rates got too high, it could be crippling. So I think the tools available to the Federal Reserve right now are quite limited. And for that reason, I think inflation may be higher for longer, as Powell has been suggesting. And I think the 2% target may be a pipe dream for the foreseeable future.
Well, not a particularly optimistic message, albeit a very sober and realistic one. So, Philip, finally, at a time like this, where inflation shows really no signs of getting down to anything remotely resembling an average or acceptable rate, people have to look for a hedge in their portfolio somewhere. Gold is an obvious place to go. It has been for centuries and centuries. So why don't you give your take on why gold, above all, right now, this is the time to get invested in gold?
Look, I think that it is simply because of the nature of our problems, right? Gold over long periods of time is about preservation of wealth, preservation of buying power. It's a steady Eddie approach. But in tough times, it can perform very well. And really what drives gold are the problems that we have, right? For those that are worried about recession, gold can function as a very good hedge, right? When things go down, demand for safe haven assets tends to increase. Gold and silver go up. They doubled within 18 months of the crash in 2008. They're performing very, very well in this climate as well. Same thing goes with inflation, right? Everyone knows what inflation is broadly. It's when things become more expensive with time. The definition of inflation is actually the rising cost of commodities and services over time. Gold and silver, being commodities, tend to increase as inflation goes up. And then finally, you've got what may be our biggest issue longer term, and this is devaluation of the dollar. Right now, we have a world that is distancing from the dollar. Central governments around the world are clambering and buying gold. Why? Because gold and the dollar have an inverse relationship. In fact, last year was the single biggest year for gold buying by central governments in history. So the world right now is betting against the dollar, and they're using gold to do it. So it's really about the climate that we're in. It's a very conducive one for safe haven assets like gold and silver.
Well, Philip Patrick, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
There you go, folks. This has been Breaking Bidenomics with Josh Hammer. If you like what you heard, you can check out my own podcast, The Josh Hammer Show. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. We hope you enjoyed this hour-long special analyzing Bidenomics for the threat that it is. And we wish you the best of luck in navigating the perils and pitfalls of Bidenomics until hopefully, we see no more Bidenomics come January 2025.
Breaking Bidenomics, brought to you by Birch Gold Group.